In the winter of 1933, in the wind-stripped mounds south of Nippur, a foreman lowered himself into a crack in the earth that had not felt daylight in nearly 4,000 years. The rope creaked. The lantern light didn't reach the floor. He would later tell the expedition director that the smell that rose to meet him was not the smell of dust. It was the smell of wet clay, and underneath it, something else. Something that should not have still been there after 40 centuries underground. He went down expecting silence. What he found instead, he said, was the feeling of being watched by a room that had been waiting for someone to remember it existed. The chamber itself was small, barely large enough for 2 men to stand upright, and almost empty. No statues, no grave goods, no trace of the elaborate funerary furniture that usually justified the expense of a season's digging. There was a broken oil lamp, its wick long since turned to ash, positioned facing the wall rather than the doorway, as though whoever last used it had been reading something rather than looking for an exit. And there was the tablet, sitting alone on a low shelf cut directly into the bedrock, not stored in a jar, not wrapped, not protected, as if whoever placed it there had not been worried about it surviving. They had been worried about it being found too soon. The team sealed the trench again before the season ended and did not return to it. The official log gives funding as the reason. Nobody who was actually on site that year ever quite repeated that explanation the same way twice. What he found in that chamber was never fully catalogued. The site notes that survive describe a small tablet, barely the width of 2 fingers, its surface scoured almost smooth by sand that should never have reached that deep below grade. The cuneiform on it was unusually fine, packed tighter than any administrative record of the period, as if the scribe had been trying to fit something enormous into something small enough to hide in a closed fist. For decades it sat unlabeled in storage, mistaken for a broken ration list, 1 box among thousands, shipped back from a dig that had already produced more tablets than anyone could read in a lifetime. It was only when a researcher ran a fresh transliteration against it that the first line resolved into a sentence that made him stop and read it again. The tablet did not describe grain or debts or kings. It described a library, and it claimed that every life ever lived was shelved inside it. When word of the full transliteration began circulating privately among Assyriologists, the reaction split almost immediately into 2 camps. And the split itself tells you something about how unusual the find was. One camp argued the tablet was a late derivative composition, a scribal exercise borrowing imagery from older underworld myths, the way a student might remix a familiar story for practice. Interesting, but not significant. The other camp, smaller and more reluctant to speak on record, pointed out that the grammar, the specific verb forms, and the style of the signs matched a much earlier period than the supposed remix theory could comfortably explain, decades before the myths it was supposedly borrowing from had even reached the form scholars know today. A planned conference presentation on the tablet was quietly pulled from the schedule 2 years running. The reason given both times was incomplete peer review. Nobody involved has explained on record what exactly remained incomplete about it. To understand why a claim like that could even be written down, you have to understand what writing meant to the people who invented it. The Sumerians did not see the written word as a record of what already existed. They saw it as the mechanism that made existence stable in the first place. Before a thing could be trusted to continue happening, it had to be written down somewhere, by someone, under someone's authority. This belief was embodied in their goddess of writing and grain, Nisaba, who was not merely a scribe among the gods, but the keeper of the boundary between what was real and what had simply been allowed to slip away unrecorded. A harvest unwritten could fail. A debt unwritten did not exist. The largest cuneiform archive ever recovered from the ancient world came out of the ground at Nippur itself, tens of thousands of tablets, because nothing in that society, however small, was considered finished until it had been pressed into clay. And the tablet found in 1933 takes that same logic and extends it 1 step further than any temple ledger ever dared. A life unwritten, it claims, had never truly happened at all. This is the seam where the claim stops being poetic and starts being unsettling. Sumerian cosmology already held that the gods governed civilization through fixed decrees called the Me, dozens of them by some counts, governing everything from kingship and priesthood to music, weaving, and the proper conduct of mourning. Above even the Me sat a single object spoken of with real dread in the later Babylonian texts that descended from this older tradition, the Tablet of Destinies, a physical object whose possession determined who held authority over heaven and earth. In one version of the myth, it is stolen by the monstrous bird Anzu and has to be violently recovered before the universe itself destabilizes. Whoever carried that tablet did not simply rule, they authored what was permitted to happen next, for everyone, everywhere. The Nippur fragment claims to describe something built on the exact same principle, but aimed at something far more intimate than kingship. Not the destiny of nations, not the complete, continuously updated record of every single person who ever drew breath. The text grows stranger the further it goes, and this is the point where more than one specialist who has examined it privately has admitted, off the record, that they are no longer sure whether they are reading theology, architecture, or something closer to a warning label. It describes a hall beneath the visible world, not in the sky, not on a mountain, but underground, oriented in the same general direction the Sumerians located their land of the dead. It is built, the tablet says, of unfired clay tablets stacked floor to ceiling, room after room, corridor folding into corridor, each tablet inscribed not after a life ends, but continuously, in real time, by hands that are never named and never once described. Every conversation, every decision almost made and then quietly abandoned, every branching version of a life that could have happened if a single choice, on a single ordinary day, had gone differently. All of it shelved, all of it preserved, none of it ever allowed to dry hard enough to be read by accident. What the tablet never does, in any surviving line, is name who is doing the inscribing. Sumerian myth is otherwise relentlessly specific about authorship. Gods are credited by name for storms, harvests, plagues, even individual diseases. This text breaks that pattern on purpose. The hands, recording every life, are described only as hands, never as a god, never as a court of judges, never even as the dead themselves working in some kind of afterlife scriptorium. Later Babylonian commentary, found on a completely separate tablet and possibly referencing this same tradition secondhand, uses a term usually reserved for the Anunnaki, the great assembly of underworld and earth deities, but stops short of actually saying they are the scribes. It is the only point in the entire text where the writing goes deliberately vague, as if naming the recorder out loud was itself considered dangerous. That last detail is the one that stops people cold. Unfired clay is fragile. A single drop of water can dissolve a tablet back into mud within minutes, undoing a scribe's work as if it had never happened. So why would the most complete archive ever conceived, an archive of every soul who ever lived, be built deliberately out of the one writing material guaranteed to erode at the slightest contact? Unless the softness was never the flaw, unless it was the entire design. A library that can still be reshaped is a library that is still alive. A finished fired record is a closed case, a life already over and settled. An unfired one means the ink, or in this case, the impression, is still wet, which means that somewhere in that hall, right now, by the tablet's own logic, your shelf is not dried yet either. The tablet does not stop at describing the hall. It claims to give instructions for finding it, and this is the part that has made certain researchers reluctant to put a full translation under their own name. The root borrows directly from the older, far better documented Sumerian myth of the goddess Inanna's descent into the underworld, the land called Kur, or Irkalla, a place Sumerian texts describe without exception as the land of no return. In that earlier myth, Inanna passes through 7 gates before reaching the throne of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and at every gate, a gatekeeper strips her of one more piece of her royal regalia, her crown, her lapis beads, her breastplate, her gold ring, her measuring rod, her robe, until she stands before the throne with nothing left that marked her, above ground, as someone who mattered. The Nippur tablet reuses this architecture of 7 gates almost exactly, but it changes what is taken at each threshold, and it changes who is doing the walking. It is not a goddess descending after her own death. It is, astonishingly, the living, deliberately, who are told they may walk the same 7 gates while still breathing, in a sustained trance achieved through prolonged darkness, fasting, and a ritual of names spoken aloud, over and over until the speaker can no longer be entirely certain whose voice is producing them. At the first gate, the tablet says, you surrender the noise of the world above. At the second, your sense of how much time has actually passed. At the third, your ability to tell memory apart from imagination, the two beginning to blur into a single substance. At the fourth, direction itself, up and down ceasing to mean anything reliable. By the fifth, your own name, handed over like a garment at a doorway. The 6th gate is the one most heavily damaged on the surviving fragment, but the partial signs that remain are usually reconstructed to mean the boundary between your voice and another's, which is itself a small horror once you sit with it. And at the 7th, the line is almost illegible from where, worn down by what the excavators assumed was simple sand erosion, but what at least one Assyriologist has suggested, half joking, half not, was worn down by how many hands had once traced it. What can be reconstructed of that final line means something very close to this. What you leave at the last gate is the certainty that you will get everything back. This is the detail that turns the library from a myth about access into a myth about cost. And it is also the point where the tablet stops reading like religious literature and starts reading like a contract. It states, in language more than one scholar has described as oddly legal for a sacred text, that the hall operates on exchange, never on generosity. Nothing may be read without something being given in return. and what is given is not incense, and it is not grain. It is a portion of the seeker's own unfired record, drawn at random from somewhere in their own life, the way a careless hand might pull a single tablet off a crowded shelf without checking which one it grabbed first. The price for viewing another life, the tablet insists, is the risk of losing a fragment of your own, and you are never, under any circumstance, told in advance which fragment it will be. There's a passage on the tablet, badly worn but partially reconstructed by comparing it against a second, smaller Old Babylonian fragment held in an entirely different collection, that appears to describe exactly this happening to someone who actually attempted the descent. It names no individual directly, only a title, Lugal, ruler, but the account describes a man who entered the seven gates seeking to read the fate of an enemy army before a coming battle, and who emerged victorious, having won precisely the knowledge he wanted, only to discover in the weeks that followed that he could no longer recall the sound of his own son's voice, not the boy's face, not a memory of him as an infant. Just the voice, gone, as cleanly removed as if it had never been recorded in the first place. The tablet frames this, not as divine punishment, not as an angry god's curse, but as simple accounting. He had asked the library for something it did not have to spare for free, and the library, the text insists almost coldly, does not lie, does not negotiate, and does not warn anyone twice. It is worth pausing on why a civilization this advanced, the same civilization that gave the world writing itself, the wheel, large-scale irrigation, and some of the earliest law codes ever set down, would also produce a myth this specific about a place where memory could be spent like currency. Some specialists who study these fragments argue it reflects something very practical about daily Mesopotamian life. A society whose entire economy ran on meticulous, almost obsessive record-keeping would naturally imagine its gods running the universe the exact same way, as a ledger, with every transaction logged somewhere by someone who never slept. Comparative mythologists have long noted how often unrelated, geographically distant cultures independently arrive at the same basic structure, an underground or otherwise hidden archive of total memory, guarded and dangerous to access. What sets the Nippur tablet apart from all of these is not the concept, it is the paperwork. Most traditions describing a record of everything stop at describing that it exists. This one is the only version on record that bothers to specify gate by gate what it costs to get inside, and what is taken from you if you cannot pay. Equally striking is how the tablet ends, because it breaks from every other underworld narrative known from the region in a way that has made more than one researcher visibly uncomfortable discussing it on camera. Most Sumerian underworld myths resolve. Inanna is restored to the world above. The dying and returning god Dumuzi is mourned, and the cycle continues. The myth closes the loop. This tablet refuses to close. Its final intact lines do not describe the hole being opened, guarded by a named deity, or destroyed in some climactic divine act. They describe it being deliberately sealed by human hands on purpose after what the badly damaged text vaguely calls a season when too many came asking. The chamber above it was filled in. The entrance was built over and abandoned, and the surrounding ground was, in the tablet's own phrasing, given back to the wind so that the sand itself would finish the work of forgetting exactly where the door had been. This detail lines up uncomfortably well with something already documented well outside this single, isolated tablet. The Babylonian priest, Berossus, writing centuries later but drawing on far older Mesopotamian tradition, recorded that before a great flood was sent to scour the earth, the accumulated wisdom of the age before the flood was deliberately inscribed onto tablets and buried in the city of Sippar, specifically so that knowledge would survive the catastrophe even if no living person did. Sippar was not chosen at random in that older account. It was a city already bound up in the Mesopotamian imagination, with judgment and divination, home to ritual specialists, the Ashipu and Baru, whose entire profession was reading signs that ordinary people were not equipped to read safely. Two separate traditions, recorded centuries apart, describing the same deliberate act. Not loss, not collapse, but a conscious decision to put something out of reach of the living and let the desert finish the job no human hand wanted to finish alone. If the hall described on this tablet is even partially grounded in a real practice, whether an actual physical archive of unfired record tablets once maintained by temple scribes, or some now lost architecture of memory that the myth later exaggerated into something cosmic, the central question stops being whether it ever existed. It becomes a much harder one. Why seal it instead of simply protecting it? Protection implies you still want it found again eventually, by the right people at the right time. Deliberate sealing, with a story built around what it costs anyone to even attempt entry, implies something closer to containment. You do not bury something that deep, behind 7 symbolic gates and a price list nobody gets to read in advance, because you are worried about thieves. You do it because you are worried about everyone, including, maybe especially, the people who are absolutely certain they are ready. The second, smaller fragment used to reconstruct the Lugal passage surfaced almost by accident, decades after the original find, in a museum collection on a different continent, cataloged under a generic heading for miscellaneous administrative debris from an unrelated 19th century acquisition. A graduate student cross-referencing sign forms for an unrelated thesis noticed the same unusual 7-part structure repeating in a context that had nothing to do with administration at all, and flagged it almost as an afterthought in a footnote. It took another researcher, working from the opposite side of the world and unaware the footnote existed, to recognize what she was looking at when she requested high-resolution photographs for comparison. 2 fragments, recovered roughly a century apart on different continents, in collections that had no documented connection to each other, describing the same 7 gates, the same price, the same warning. Coincidence is the explanation everyone defaults to first. It becomes a harder explanation to hold on to the longer you sit with how specific the overlap actually is. Modern remote sensing has only made this harder to file away as folklore. Satellite and aerial surveys of the floodplain south of Nippur, the same general region where the original tablet was recovered, have repeatedly flagged a rectilinear subsurface anomaly that does not match the footprint of any known temple, granary, or residential structure already excavated nearby. It sits several meters below a layer of windblown sand that geologists studying the area estimate would have taken centuries, not years, to accumulate naturally, which raises an uncomfortable question of its own. Was the structure simply abandoned and slowly buried the way most ruins eventually are, worn down by ordinary time? Or was that depth of covering sand achieved deliberately, encouraged, perhaps even physically assisted, by people who wanted the desert to finish a job their own hands had already started? No excavation permit has ever been granted for that specific anomaly. Decades of regional instability, shifting borders, war, and collapsing funding have left it untouched, sitting almost exactly where the tablet's final legible lines say it was left, sealed, surrounded by sand, waiting. Every so often, a research team announces renewed interest, secures partial funding, and the project quietly stalls before a single trench is ever cut. Researchers who have worked near the site describe a strange, hard-to-articulate reluctance among local survey teams to push the proposal forward, a hesitation nobody quite puts into words, the kind that looks, from the outside, less like ordinary bureaucracy and more like instinct doing its job without being asked. So the tablet sits in a drawer, translated, photographed, argued over for decades, and still largely unpublished in full. The anomaly sits in the ground, mapped from above but unopened from within, exactly where a 4,000-year-old text says a hall containing every life ever lived was sealed away on purpose, by people who had clearly seen enough of what was inside to decide nobody else should. And somewhere between those 2 facts sits the question this story was always going to end on, the one no satellite pass and no transliteration has managed to answer. If that hall is real, and if it is still down there, holding a record of a life that is not finished being written, the question is no longer whether someone will eventually try to open it. It is what they will be willing to leave behind at the 7th gate when they do.